Have you ever imagined living in the shadow of a giant that once dominated half the world? Today, more than 3 decades after the end of the Soviet Union, its ghosts still haunt Ukraine. On February 24, 2022, tanks crossed the border and the world held its breath. War returned to Europe. Who controls the gas that heats homes? Who sets the price of wheat that feeds billions? Who decides whether a country can exist freely? These are questions that reveal the heart of a centuries-old conflict, painted in shades of red and black. When sirens sound in Kyiv, we are reminded that the power of an empire doesn't disappear with the snap of a finger, infiltrates lives. The choices of neighbors, the price of bread. Are you ready to understand how the Soviet legacy shaped today's greatest conflict? Your timer reads 8 o'clock, and as everyone runs for cover, you wonder, how far will this war go? The tension is real. Bombs explode in Donetsk. Children dream of a future without fear. Governments debate sanctions that threaten to bring down entire economies. In every headline, an invisible thread connects yesterday's Kremlin to today's chaos. In this video, we'll tear apart this veil of silence and reveal the Soviet foundations that sustain Ukrainian instability. Brace yourself, the truths are harsh, but understanding them is the first step to fighting back. The tension isn't just on the streets, it pulsates through energy supply contracts, rapidly escalating refugee flows, and military alliances that tremble with each new declaration. Imagine yourself on the balcony of an apartment in Odessa watching ships laden with corn set sail to feed the world, while the sound of missiles echoes on the horizon. It is this brutal contrast that shows us the cost of keeping alive a Soviet influence that never completely disappeared, and this is where our journey begins, unraveling the web that connects history and the present. Have you ever wondered why Kyiv holds out even under heavy fire? Why NATO trembles with every Russian troop movement? How did we get here? From Yalta to Bucha, from Stalin to Zelensky? The answer lies in the past, in the 1954 peace treaty, in the forced displacement of populations, in secret agreements signed in the corridors of freezing palaces. Each decision shaped the political geography, each leader left footprints that today become craters. In this documentary, we'll travel back in time to connect each dot and understand the common thread of an empire that refuses to die. But before we return to the past, one final question. If history can repeat itself, are we aware of the mistakes that could lead us to the abyss? At this very moment, millions of Ukrainians live in the uncertainty of an imminent bombardment, thousands flee in makeshift convoys, and the world watches, apprehensive, fearing an escalation that could drag entire continents. It is this sense of urgency that sets the tone for our narrative. Buckle up, because the road is long, the revelations are intense, and the price of ignorance can be too high. In the 1920s, the USSR emerged from the ashes of the Russian Revolution, proclaiming itself a beacon of global socialism. Joseph Stalin consolidated his power with fire and sword, redrawing borders for geopolitical and ideological reasons. In 1922, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic became one of the founding members of the Soviet Union, losing its autonomy in the name of a centralizing project. Millions of peasants were forced to collectivize their lands during the Holodomor of 1932-33, a deliberate famine that decimated around 4 million victims. This profound trauma fuels the Ukrainian desire for full independence to this day. Each village sacrificed its dead and burned their memories. While Moscow consolidated absolute control over Ukrainian wheat, the main export for feeding Europe, the ancestral pain of the Holodomor remains alive in the generations that have passed on. In silent stories, the desire to never again depend on an external power that steals identity and subsistence. During World War II, Ukraine was a decisive battleground. Nazi and Soviet troops clashed across vast Ukrainian territories, razing cities and villages. In 1944, the Soviet front recaptured Kyiv and Lviv, but not without devastation. Millions of civilians died, and infrastructure was destroyed. After the victory over Hitler, Stalin shifted from ally to oppressor, repressing Ukrainian nationalists who fought against Nazism. Operation Christmas Eve deported entire communities of ethnic minorities, aiming to consolidate political uniformity. The collective trauma of occupation and reconquest shaped a chronic distrust between Russians and Ukrainians. The Soviet regime practiced an exercise in population control, investing in Russian colonization of Ukrainian lands and erasing local legacies. This systematic policy of cultural and demographic ruin laid the foundation for the territorial disputes we see today. embedded in centuries-old resentments. In 1954, Nikita Khrushchev transferred Crimea from the Russian Soviet Republic to Ukraine to commemorate the tricentennial of their union. Although presented as a symbolic gesture, this act lacked popular consultation and contradicted the principle of self-determination. The majority Russian presence on the peninsula and the existence of Black Sea Fleet bases kept Moscow alert to any change in control of Sebastopol. Decades later, in 2014, Moscow justified the annexation of Crimea as the restoration of a historical bond, ignoring international agreements that guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity. This set a dangerous precedent. Brute force trumped diplomacy and the rule of law. The border transfer, carried out without the people's consent, created a domino effect, encouraging separatists in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions to question their loyalty to Kyiv and subsequently seek Russian protection. Between the collapse of the USSR in 1991 and the 2000s, Ukraine experienced a fragile independence. The 1994 Budapest Memorandum, signed by Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, promised to respect Ukraine's borders in exchange for relinquishing the nuclear arsenal inherited from Moscow. However, this guarantee proved to be a dead letter when, in 2014, Russia invaded Crimea and supported uprisings in the east. The young Ukrainian democracy oscillated between pro-Western orientations and ties to Moscow, experiencing popular uprisings such as the 2004 Orange Revolution and the 2013-14 Euromaidan. Each mobilization demonstrated the popular desire for reforms and integration into the European Union and NATO, but also exposed the resistance of pro-Russian elites. The Western versus Russian power struggle defined regional alliances and reinforced the feeling of antagonistic identities, polarizing families and communities. The role of Gazprom and other Russian state-owned companies in supplying natural gas has revealed a second battlefield, the economic one. During the icy winters, supply cuts in 2006 and 2009 affected not only Ukraine but also several European countries that depended on gas pipelines crossing Ukrainian territory. These fuel blockades became a weapon of political and market pressure, highlighting how Soviet legacies in energy infrastructure perpetuate dynamics of domination. The EU, driven to diversify suppliers, adopted sanctions and alternative gas pipeline projects like Nord Stream, but amid legal disputes and tumultuous negotiations, energy dependence reinforced Ukraine's strategic vulnerability, shaping a key part of the genesis of current tensions. We cannot forget the ideological weight. The Ukrainian Communist Party maintained strong influence in the 1990s, while nationalist movements flourished in opposition to the Soviet past. Education, media, and civic celebrations became symbolic battlegrounds, competing narratives about national heroes and the tears of victims less remembered in the official curriculum. Each monument toppled, each street renamed, represented a break with the Soviet heritage and a step toward rebuilding a unique identity. However, in Russian-majority regions, this deconstruction was felt as a cultural attack, generating resentment and resistance. It is this mosaic of conflicting memories that brings us to the present, a Ukraine divided between two worldviews, each fueled by decades of historical decisions, energy policies, and narrative constructions that overlap on a stage of geopolitical tension. In 2025, as winter approaches, millions of Ukrainian homes still shiver without sufficient heating. Russian gas waivers in 2022 were just the beginning. Makeshift solar panels spring up on rooftops, while families alternate shower times to conserve hot water. Imagine the scene, mothers wrapping children in blankets at 4 p.m. as peak consumption times trigger tariffs that reach nearly 300% of normal. For Western Europe, the war in Ukraine means fuel rationing and a 40% increase in gas prices since the conflict began. For developing countries, this translates into a shortage of fertilizers derived from gas and crop failures that fall by up to 30%, generating food crises in such long chains that they affect even Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, in ports like Odessa and Chornomorsk, ships laden with grain are setting sail to feed North Africa, but in 25% fewer quantities than before 2022. Wars are raging. African countries compete for limited containers, driving up the price of bread by up to 60% in places where it accounts for half of daily calories. The United Nations estimates that 17 million Ukrainians have now been internally displaced or fled to neighboring countries, creating the largest European exodus since World War II. The Baltic republics and Poland, home to more than 5 million refugees, are facing social tensions, overcrowded schools, a lack of daycare spaces, and growing resentment in local communities that see their own economies stagnating. And while these human dramas unfold, agribusiness and oil giants are reaping billions in profits. The war tripled Gazprom's profits in 2022 and 2023, allowing the Russian state-owned company to continue investing in propaganda and military operations. Western investors, in turn, poured billions into defense companies Lockheed Martin, Rheinmetall, and Rafael, which have seen revenue spikes thanks to contracts to sell missiles and radar systems to Kyiv. Every explosion on the front line sends stock prices soaring on the New York and Frankfurt stock exchanges. In a macabre dance where human life becomes a commodity, on the ground in Ukraine, tens of thousands of civilians suffer from indiscriminate bombings. In Bakhmut, civilians report sleeping in subway stations converted into shelters, dark, unventilated holes where stories are told by flashlights. In Kherson, farmers recount how many bombs have hit their fields. With each crater, our livelihood disappears, says Ivan, 58, speaking through tears. World Bank data shows that Ukraine's GDP fell 35% between 2021 and 2023, while inflation exceeded 20% annually, eroding wages and savings reserves. In many homes, the refrigerators are empty, and markets sell only the basics: bread, oil, and pasta. The crisis generates a new wave of solidarity and an avalanche of misinformation. Humanitarian NGOs report, but 60% of aid packages never reach their intended destination, diverted by paramilitary groups controlling peripheral roads. At the same time, thousands of manipulated posts circulate online, suggesting that Ukrainian refugees are receiving extra wages for seeking asylum in Germany. This war over narrative fuels hatred between neighbors. In Vilnius and Bucharest, Ukrainian immigrants report verbal abuse and discrimination in shops. The United Nations Refugee Office warns that the next challenge is protecting these displaced people from a new type of violence: asylum discrimination. On the diplomatic front, every gesture counts. When the European Union announces an additional 18 billion euros in military aid, the Kremlin complains of escalation and threatens to cut all fertilizer exports. When NATO sends 24 F-16 fighter jets, Moscow responds with naval exercises in the Baltic Sea. And so, the playing field expands. Smaller allies are urged to choose sides. While international markets retreat into speculation, oil prices close 5% higher whenever news of new Russian attacks arrives. The dollar strengthens, emerging currencies plummet, and economic emergencies multiply from Chile to India, from Bangladesh to Lebanon. Every Ukrainian family has learned the hard way that, in modern war, suffering is measured not only in lives lost, but in entire days spent by candlelight, in regional blackouts, in schools closing for lack of teachers, in hospitals without medicine. The invisible cost is a monster that grows unseen. It is energy insecurity, silent hunger, the drying up of foreign investment, latent fear. But amid this chaos, gestures of solidarity emerge that illuminate the darkness. Polish children learning Ukrainian to make refugee friends. Volunteers in Lithuania sewing winter coats for those who have lost everything. Radio correspondents broadcasting news in Russian and Ukrainian to reach divided communities. This is a brutal portrait of the present, a war not limited to front lines, but to networks of global interdependence, where everything from a bowl of soup to a heated window has become a direct consequence of decisions made nearly a century ago. The Soviet legacy, now unfolding in gas cuts, exile sentences, and massive profits for arms companies, leaves a trail of questions that echo to this day. And you, are you willing to face not only the visible horrors, but also the invisible cost that each bombing unleashes in markets, hearts, and consciences around the world? Imagine waking up in March 2026 to the headline, "New fighting north of Izium," and realizing that the war that seemed confined to eastern Ukraine has now spread across the Romanian border. Analysts warn that the risk of escalation is not a remote possibility, but a constant shadow hanging over all of Eastern Europe. With sanctions weakening the Russian economy, some believe Moscow may adopt even more aggressive tactics to divert domestic discontent: large-scale cyberattacks on critical networks, sabotage of pipelines supplying the Baltic, hybrid operations to undermine elections in neighboring countries. If these scenarios come to fruition, tomorrow we could see tanks on NATO soil, not in Ukrainian territory, but in Poland or the Baltic states under the pretext of defending Russian minorities. the same time, there is the silent threat of digital warriors. In state-sponsored hacker labs, malicious code is being forged to bring down nuclear power plants or contaminate water treatment systems. Zelensky himself has warned that the next major offensive may not use grenades, but lines of code. Analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies predict that, without an international cyber cooperation agreement, within 2 years we could face blackouts in European capitals, stock market crashes, and logistical chaos at ports serving agricultural exports. Every keyboard click could trigger a social collapse, turning unsuspecting civilians into victims of an invisible war. And what about the average citizen? Consider the farmer in Venetia, already dealing with Russian missiles and power outages. If the conflict continues, his fields could be targeted by kamikaze drones that attack grain silos or spray toxic pesticides to ruin crops. Economically, investment funds could abandon Ukraine, reversing the flow of capital that arrived as aid and turning promises of reconstruction into financial deserts. Even the use of cryptocurrencies, which exploded during the war, could be weaponized, money laundering to finance militias or facilitating arms smuggling, as governments struggle to regulate anonymous transactions. Meanwhile, the international community faces its own dilemma. NATO is discussing the possibility of creating red zones in Ukraine, fortified bastions where air defenses would be reinforced with Patriot missiles and fifth-generation fighter jets. However, this would put soldiers from various allied countries at direct risk of confrontation with Russian troops. Washington is considering offering long-range missiles to Kyiv, but knows this could be interpreted by Moscow as an act of war, leading to devastating retaliation. The European Union, for its part, is debating whether to extend the embargo on Russian oil, aware that a complete cut would raise the price of oil to unprecedented levels and plunge the old continent into fuel rationing, drastic tax increases, and even power outages in the coming winters. Finally, a dark question looms. What if, instead of ending, this conflict becomes a permanent state of tension? Low-intensity wars, with bombings interspersed with fragile ceasefires, could drag on for decades, keeping Ukraine constantly rebuilding and draining public resources. In this scenario, armies would not demobilize but would be trained for urban and cyber operations daily. Defense and energy companies would become perpetual war industries, and civil society would survive in secure bubbles, separated by walls and checkpoints, learning to live with a violent normality. The next war may not need soldiers, and it may already have begun. In bits and bytes, on social media and in the corridors of power. At this point, it's up to you to reflect. Are we willing to allow the Soviet legacy to continue to dictate the future of an entire generation? Or can we forge a new path, based on cooperation, energy, innovation, and mutual respect among nations? The answer to this question will determine whether we will have a bright tomorrow or remain in the shadows of a conflict that refuses to die. The Soviet legacy is more than a geopolitical legacy. It is a scar opened in the collective memory. Every shell, tremor, every gas cut, every sanction imposed, and every refugee cry reflects decisions made nearly a century ago. As we tell this story, it's impossible to forget that, behind the statistics and maps, there are people whose fates were determined in the icy corridors of palaces and in offices, filled with papers signed without popular consultation. When a young Ukrainian soldier raises the blue and yellow flag in a recaptured village, he rewrites not only the geography of the territory but also the meaning of freedom for future generations. But what comes next? If Ukraine wins this war, it won't be a full stop but a comma. Reconstruction will require not just restoring buildings but reclaiming an identity torn apart by decades of assimilation policies. Schools will have to rewrite curricula celebrating local heroes and preserving the memory of the victims of the Holodomor, the deportees of 1944, the Euromaidan activists, and the civilians who fell in the 2022 bombings. We will need to decide which monuments to erect and which streets to rename, because each name carries a meaning, a choice about what we want to celebrate and what we must never forget. Economically, it will be essential to diversify energy suppliers and rebuild damaged infrastructure. The Russian gas blockade pandemic has shown that relying on a single point of failure leaves even the most advanced democracies vulnerable. The transition to clean energy sources, solar, wind, hydroelectric, and the creation of smart energy distribution grids are not only environmental goals, but pillars of national security. It's time to transform the bitter lessons of post-war renewal into a new chapter of innovation. Drawing on the expertise of local companies, the solidarity of Western partners, and the resilient spirit of Ukrainians. Socially, we will have to address intergenerational trauma, community psychology programs, storytelling, peace education, and cultural exchanges must be strengthened so that yesterday's wounds don't turn into tomorrow's resentments. The inclusion of minorities, respect for the Ukrainian, Russian, Tatar, and Hungarian languages, as well as the recognition of deported communities will be fundamental measures. If we want a united Ukraine, we need to create spaces for dialogue where young people who have never experienced the horrors of war can learn from those who have. From a geopolitical perspective, Ukraine's success will require a cautious approach toward Moscow. Reconciliation does not mean complacency in the face of war crimes, but rather the pursuit of multilateral guarantees that prevent further aggression, strengthening international treaties, expanding OSCE monitoring mechanisms, and creating regional, transitional justice tribunals could serve as the foundation for a European security system that avoids repeating past mistakes. After all, trust is not built solely with tanks pulled from the border, but with commitments made under international law. On the diplomatic front, the expansion of the European Union and NATO should not be driven solely by military leadership, but also through economic, cultural, and educational cooperation programs. Scholarships, academic partnerships, and investments in local startups can forge lasting ties, creating a generation of leaders who see the West as more than a power bloc but a space of shared values. When young Ukrainians travel to universities, in Berlin, Warsaw, or Lyon, they will take with them stories of resilience and return with ideas for rebuilding villages, modernizing industries, and revitalizing communities. But make no mistake, this path will require sacrifice and discipline. Endemic corruption, inherited from opaque systems, must be combated with institutional reforms, fiscal transparency, and citizen participation. Every Ukrainian who exposes embezzlement in reconstruction contracts will be a silent hero of the new era. Every judge who applies the law fairly will rewrite, in bytes and official stamps, the foundations of a rule of law that has long awaited a new chapter. On the horizon, there are also emerging risks. Rural desertification due to inactivated mines, groundwater pollution from ammunition dumps, and the physical and psychological scars on combatants who will return homeless and without hope. Therefore, it is urgent to plan daycare centers, rehabilitation, hospitals, professional retraining programs, and welcoming policies for veterans and displaced civilians. Reconstruction must be integrated and inclusive, considering the 44 million Ukrainians as co-authors of a future free from fear. Finally, each viewer must reflect personally. Are we willing to learn from history, or will we stumble upon the same mistakes? The next time we get home and turn on the light bulb, may it be a symbol of clean, independent energy, not a gas pipeline controlled by geopolitical interests. May we, when looking at a verdant field, see not only wheat, but also the seed of peace sprouting. And may we, when shaking hands with a refugee neighbor, feel that rebuilding nations is, above all, an act of humanity. If we understand that the Soviet legacy still shapes our choices, then the key to a better future lies in the combination of memory and innovation, of justice and solidarity. The war in Ukraine was fueled by past mistakes, but its outcome can nourish tomorrow with hope. And you, after hearing this story, what legacy do you want to leave for future generations? The answer lies in our actions today.